The wooden butter churn sat crooked on the packed earth floor, its iron bands catching the slant of late evening light that never fully surrendered to night, and Warren Hansdaughter could not stop staring at the crack running through its oak slats, wondering when it would finally split apart. 8 hours more of this midsummer twilight remained. 8 hours of half-brightness. Her husband, Reverend John Steingrimson, had ridden northeast 3 days prior to tend to a dying farmer in the highlands. The sheep bleated in the home field. The river Skafta ran clear and cold, swollen with glacial melt from Vatnajökull. Everything was exactly as it had always been, except the crack in the churn, except the strange warmth rising through the floorboards, except the sulfur stench that had crept into the valley 2 mornings ago, so faint that Warren had blamed it on a rotting fish head left by the neighbor's cat. In the village, the 613 souls of the parish moved through their evening rituals. Old Magnus Johnson mended a fishing net with fingers bent like driftwood. The midwife, Gurun Einarsdóttir, boiled birch bark for a poultice. Children chased a 3-legged dog through the churchyard, their laughter carrying across the silent graves of 7 generations. Warren pressed her palm against the earthen wall. The vibration was so subtle she might have imagined it a tremor no stronger than a sleeping heartbeat. But she had lived 54 years on this volcanic island. She knew what the earth felt like when it was content, and this was not contentment. This was the held breath before a scream. 300 kilometers to the southeast, in the highland wilderness that no one called home, a 27-kilometer fissure was preparing to tear open the belly of the world. The Skafta River had been running strangely for days warmer than usual, carrying a faint blue tint, smelling of something that reminded the farmers of burnt matches and spoiled eggs. Glacial ice was melting somewhere upstream, flooding down channels that should have been frozen solid until August. Warren walked to the doorway of the turf house and looked toward the mountains. The sky over the highlands held an odd yellow haze, thick as sheep's wool, that had appeared yesterday and refused to burn off. The sheep had stopped bleating. The silence hit her like cold water. 600 animals in the home field, and not one made a sound. They stood motionless, every head turned toward the same point on the distant horizon, their eyes reflecting that strange yellow light. The church bells began to ring not the measured toll of evening service, but a wild, desperate clanging. The sexton had seen something. The whole village had seen it now. A column of black smoke rising from the earth, where there should have been only ice and stone, climbing higher and higher until it blotted out the midnight sun. Then the sound reached them. It began as a rumble, then swelled to a roar that shook the pictures from the walls and sent the crockery crashing from the shelves. The ground buckled. The butter churn finally split apart, spilling its contents across the floor in a white flood that looked, for one terrible moment, like bones. Warren gripped the doorframe as the world she had known for 54 years ended with a sound like God clearing his throat. Asterisk, asterisk, it has begun. Asterisk, asterisk. The lava arrived in the river gorge 4 days after the fissure opened, moving faster than a man could run, a glowing snake of molten rock that hissed and screamed as it devoured the Skafta's waters and turned them to steam. Reverend John had ridden home through a landscape transforming into hell. The air had thickened with sulfurous gases, so dense he could taste metal on his tongue. His horse had gone half-blind from the ash, and he'd walked the last 20 kilometers, leading the animal by its bridle, his boots leaving prints in gray powder that covered everything: grass, rocks, the backs of dead sheep. By the time he reached Kirkjubajarkloster, 42 days had passed since the first eruption. The midnight sun had become a blood-red smear behind a permanent haze. The grass in the home field had turned yellow, then brown, then white, with a powdery residue that burned when touched. The sheep that ate it developed swollen joints and loose teeth. Their wool fell out in clumps. They died standing up, frozen in postures of agony. John found Warren organizing the evacuation of outlying farms. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from handling the contaminated hay, her eyes red-rimmed from weeks of sulfur exposure. When she saw him in the doorway, she did not run to embrace him. She simply said, "The lava is 12 kilometers away. It will reach us by Sunday." The numbers arrived like blows. 80% of the sheep were dead or dying. Half the cattle, half the horses. The hay harvest was contaminated. The rivers ran hot and blue with sulfuric acid. Fish floated belly up in every stream. The children had developed racking coughs that would not stop, and the elderly were simply falling asleep and not waking up. And the eruption showed no signs of stopping. 130 craters had opened along the fissure, belching fire fountains that lit the horizon like a second sunrise. The lava had already swallowed 30 farms. 2 churches had vanished beneath flows that moved in waves, advancing and retreating as if the earth itself were breathing. John made his choice on July 18th. He announced there would be a service on July 20th, not in the outlying chapel where people had been sheltering, but in the main church at Kirkjubajarkloster, the church that stood directly in the path of the advancing lava, the church that would certainly be destroyed within hours. "We will not run," he told his congregation. "We will pray." They came because there was nowhere else to go. 600 people crowded into a stone building designed for 100, pressing against each other in the sulphurous darkness as the ground shook beneath their feet. Through the warped glass windows, they could see the lava glowing orange on the hillside, less than 2 kilometers away. John Steingrimson climbed into the pulpit and began to speak. He did not speak of comfort. He spoke of sin. He spoke of the wages of moral failure, of the greed and cruelty that had infected their community, of the indifference they had shown to each other and to God. His voice rose above the rumbling of the earth, above the crash of thunder from the volcanic lightning, above the wailing of children and the sobs of the terrified. For 3 hours he preached. The candles guttered in the poisoned air. The stones of the church groaned as tremors passed through them. And outside, the lava continued its advance, a wall of molten rock 40 meters high, consuming everything in its path. When the congregation finally emerged, blinking into the hazy twilight, they discovered that the lava had stopped. It had halted at a bend in the river gorge, exactly where the cooling waters pooled deepest. The leading edge of the flow had solidified into a wall of black basalt, steaming and cracking as it cooled. Behind it, the liquid rock had diverted, flowing away from the village, away from the church, away from the people who had gathered to meet their deaths. They called it Eldmestangi, the fire sermon point. Some believed John had performed a miracle. John himself believed nothing of the sort. He had simply noticed, in the weeks of watching the lava's progress, that it always stopped where water met stone. The river bend had saved them. Physics had saved them. But he let them believe what they needed to believe, because the truth, that they had survived by chance and observation, not divine intervention, would not help them face what was coming. Because the eruption had not stopped. The fissure was still bleeding fire into the sky, and the poison was spreading. That night, Warren found a letter in her husband's coat pocket. A report from Reykjavik, carried by a half-dead messenger who had ridden for 6 days through the ash. The letter contained news that recontextualized everything they thought they understood about their situation. The haze had reached Europe. Ships were unable to navigate in the fog. Thousands were dying in England, in France, in Germany, people who had never seen Iceland, who could not point to it on a map, choking on air that had traveled 2,000 kilometers from a crack in the earth. This was not a local disaster. This was the end of the world as everyone knew it. Asterisk, asterisk, winter 1783 to 1784, asterisk, asterisk. The sun set in September and did not properly rise again until March. The volcanic haze had merged with the polar darkness, creating a winter of absolute blackness, broken only by the occasional blood-red glow of the still erupting fissure. Warren stopped counting the dead after the first 100. There was no point. The bodies came faster than they could be buried in the frozen ground. Farmers who had survived the initial eruption, only to starve when their livestock perished. Children who developed the strange bone-softening disease from drinking contaminated water. Elderly who simply lay down in the ash and refused to get up. The contaminated grass had done its work with terrible efficiency. The fluorine in the volcanic ash had accumulated in every blade, every leaf, every root. Animals that ate it developed skeletal fluorosis. Their teeth loosened, their bones became brittle, their joints swelled until movement became agony. They died slowly over weeks, their bodies collapsing from within. And then the famine came for the humans. With no livestock, there was no milk, no cheese, no meat. With no hay, there could be no surviving animals. With the rivers poisoned and the fish dead, there was nothing to catch. The farms that had sustained families for generations became tombs. The Danish government in Copenhagen debated what to do. A proposal circulated to evacuate the entire Icelandic population, 40,000 starving people, to Denmark, where they could serve as laborers in factories. Iceland would be abandoned. 800 years of settlement erased. In Kirkjubæjarklaustur, now home to fewer than 200 souls, John Steingrimsson faced his mirror moment. He had saved his church. He had saved his congregation from the lava. But he could not save them from starvation. Every day brought impossible choices. Which family received the last handful of grain? Which child was strong enough to possibly survive the winter? Which elder should be allowed to die so that the young might live? A ship had run aground on the southern coast, its cargo of flour and hemp miraculously salvageable. John organized the distribution. He made his lists. He weighed each soul against the arithmetic of survival. And then, on December 7th, Warren died. Not from starvation, not from the fluorine poisoning that was claiming so many. She simply fell asleep by the fire and did not wake up. 54 years of living on this volcanic island, and in the end, her heart had simply stopped, worn out by grief, by terror, by the weight of watching her world collapse. John buried her in the churchyard, in frozen ground that took 3 days to dig. He spoke no words over her grave. He had no words left. That night, alone in the turf house that still smelled of her, surrounded by the possessions of their life together, the spinning wheel she had used, the cooking pot blackened by decades of use, the bed they had shared, Steingrimsson sat in the darkness and confronted the truth he had been avoiding. He had told his congregation that God had saved them. He had told them the fire sermon was a miracle, that their prayers had turned back the lava, that divine providence was protecting them. He had lied. The lava had stopped because of geology, not grace. And the same indifferent universe that had placed a river bend in exactly the right location had also poisoned the air they breathed, the water they drank, the food they needed to survive. There was no divine plan. There was only the random cruelty of a planet that had no regard for human suffering. Asterisk, asterisk. And then John realized that the faith he had preached his entire life was a lie. Asterisk, asterisk. But in that same moment, sitting in the darkness with his dead wife's shawl pressed against his face, he understood something else. The lie was necessary. His people needed to believe in meaning. They needed to believe their suffering had purpose, that their survival mattered, that the universe cared whether they lived or died. Without that belief, they would simply give up, lie down in the ash like so many others, and let death take them. So John would continue to lie. He would preach faith he no longer felt. He would speak of God's mercy while watching children starve. He would maintain the fiction of meaning in a meaningless universe. Because the fiction was the only thing keeping his people alive, he picked up his quill and began to write. Not a sermon or record. Every death, every observation, every detail of the catastrophe unfolding around him. If Iceland survived this, if humanity survived this, Someone would need to know what had happened. Someone would need to learn from their suffering. The truth would wait. The lie would save them. February 1784. February 1786. The eruption finally stopped on February 7, 1784, 8 months after it began. The fissure sealed itself, the fire fountains died, and the haze began slowly to thin. But the dying did not stop. The contaminated soil would not support crops for years. The livestock population had been so devastated that breeding pairs were nearly non-existent. The ash continued to poison wells and streams. And a new enemy had emerged, a disease the Icelanders called landfarsort, the traveling sickness, which swept through the weakened population like fire through dry grass. By 1786, Iceland's population had fallen from 50,000 to 38,000. 1/5 of the nation had died. In some districts, the death rate exceeded 60%. John Steingrimsson's parish had shrunk from 613 souls to 93. The Danish proposal to evacuate Iceland gained momentum. Ships were being prepared. Lists were being drawn up. The complete abandonment of the island seemed inevitable. But John had spent 3 years watching his people die, and in that suffering, he had witnessed something unexpected: adaptation. The survivors were not simply enduring, they were learning. They had discovered that certain coastal areas, washed clean by the tides, could support limited grazing. They had found that fish were returning to the deeper fjords, where the contamination had not reached. They had begun to understand which wells were safe and which were poisoned, which foods could be eaten and which would kill. Most importantly, they had stopped waiting for salvation. They had stopped looking to the sky for miracles. They had started looking at each other. The flaw that had defined John's entire ministry, his inability to offer false comfort, his compulsion to speak hard truths, became his weapon. At a gathering of parish leaders in early 1785, he stood before the assembled remnants of Iceland's population and delivered not a sermon but a plan. "The Danes believe we cannot survive," he said. "They believe this land has defeated us. They are preparing ships to carry us away like cargo, to deposit us in a foreign country where we will spend our lives as laborers for strangers." He paused. The assembly was silent. "I say we prove them wrong, not with prayers, not with faith, with stubbornness, with the same obstinacy that has kept our ancestors alive on this impossible island for 800 years. We rebuild, we breed the surviving animals. We plant in the clean soil. We drink from the safe wells. We do not ask God for help. We help ourselves. We stay." The word hung in the poisoned air like a declaration of war. The evacuation proposal died quietly in Copenhagen. The logistics had always been impossible. Transporting 40,000 people across the North Atlantic was beyond 18th century capabilities. But the Danes needed a reason to abandon the plan, and John's defiance gave them one. The Icelanders would not leave. They would rebuild on the bones of their dead, in the shadow of the volcano that had nearly destroyed them, because this poisoned, frozen, impossible land was home. The work began immediately. Every surviving sheep was precious beyond measure, a genetic repository for the future. Every safe well was mapped and protected. Every scrap of uncontaminated hay was hoarded like gold. John threw himself into the effort with the same intensity he had once devoted to preaching. He organized work parties. He mediated disputes over scarce resources. He kept his meticulous records, documenting every death, every birth, every small victory in the struggle to survive. And he continued to lie. He continued to preach sermons about God's mercy and divine providence, even though he no longer believed a word of it. The fiction of meaning was too important to abandon. His people needed to believe their suffering had purpose, and if that belief was a useful lie, then John would tell it with conviction. On a February morning in 1786, exactly 2 years after the eruption ended, John rode to the fire sermon point, the place where the lava had stopped its advance toward his church. The black basalt had cooled and cracked, creating strange formations that caught the weak winter light. Steam still rose from fissures in the rock, evidence of heat that would take decades to fully dissipate. John dismounted and walked to the edge of the lava field. In the distance, he could see the new growth. Not much, just a few hardy plants pushing through the ash, moss beginning its slow colonization of the black stone. In another 100 years, this would be a meadow. In another 1,000, it would look like it had never burned. He thought about Warren, about the 520 parishioners he had buried, about the lie that had kept the survivors alive, and the truth that had kept him writing, documenting, preserving the memory of what had happened here. He thought about the crack in the butter churn that had been Horane's last normal observation 3 years ago, before the world ended. A sound reached him faint, almost lost in the wind. He turned. A child was walking toward him through the ash. A girl, perhaps 6 years old, one of the few children born after the eruption. She was carrying something in her arms, a lamb newborn, still wet from delivery. Reverend John, she called. The Away had twins, 2 lambs, 2 new lives. The first twins born in the parish since the disaster began. John felt something shift in his chest, not faith, not belief, but something older and simpler. The future had arrived, bleeding and wet, and utterly indifferent to the devastation that had preceded it. He lifted his hand to shield his eyes from the pale sun. Summer 1791, present day. John Steingrimsson died on August 11th, 1791, 7 years after the eruption ended. He was 63 years old. The cause of death was never recorded, but those who knew him understood. He had simply worn out. He had given everything he had to his people, and when the crisis finally passed, there was nothing left. They buried him beside Warren in the churchyard at Kirkjubajar Cloister, in the same frozen ground he had dug open to receive her body 7 years before. The gravestone was simple, just a name and 2 dates. No mention of the fire sermon. No mention of the thousands of pages he had written, documenting every detail of the catastrophe. The manuscripts he left behind would become the most important historical record of the eruption. Volcanologists still cite his observations today. His descriptions of lava behavior, of gas emissions, of the progression of fluorine poisoning through the food chain, remain scientifically valuable 240 years later. But John would not have cared about that. He wrote to remember. He wrote so the dead would not be forgotten. He wrote because it was the only honest thing he could do in a world full of necessary lies. The lava field at Keldmesitangi still exists. Over the centuries, it has transformed. The black basalt is now covered with a thick carpet of Icelandic moss soft, impossibly green, growing only a few millimeters each year. Visitors walk carefully across it, following marked paths, marveling at the strange beauty of a landscape shaped by destruction.
In the village of Kirkjubajarkloster, still called just Clouster by locals, a memorial chapel stands where John S. Church once stood. The original building rotted away in the 19th century, replaced, renovated, replaced again. But the location remains the same, the exact spot where 600 people crowded together to meet what they believed would be their deaths, and emerged to find that the world had granted them one more chance. Iceland's population today is over 380,000, more than 7 times what it was before the eruption. Reykjavik, once a tiny fishing village, has become a modern capital city. The country that the Danish government once proposed to abandon has become one of the most prosperous nations on earth. Its geothermal energy, its fisheries, its tourism industry, all built upon the same volcanic forces that nearly destroyed it. The Laki fissure remains dormant. Scientists monitor it constantly, their instruments detecting every tremor, every temperature change, every hint that the Earth might be preparing to crack open again. Another Laki-scale eruption is not a question of if but when. The average recurrence time is 300 to 500 years. The last eruption was 240 years ago. Somewhere in the highlands, beneath the glacial ice, The magma is still there, waiting, and in the old churchyard at Clouster, where the tour buses rarely stop, a worn gravestone marks the final resting place of a man who lied to save his people and told the truth to save their memory. The moss grows over the inscription now, softening the edges of the letters, slowly reclaiming the stone for the earth. But if you look carefully, if you brush away the green growth and trace the shapes with your fingers, you can still make out the name. Below the grave, perhaps 30 meters away, there is a low rise in the ground, unmarked, unremarkable. But anyone who knows the history understands what lies beneath, the mass grave of the Eruption's victims. Dozens of bodies piled together because there weren't enough survivors to dig individual plots. The moss grows thicker there. The grass is greener. Death has become fertilizer, and the land that killed so many now flourishes on their remains. Near the edge of the churchyard, partially hidden by a wooden fence, sits a reconstructed turf house, a museum piece now, showing tourists how Icelanders lived in the 18th century. Inside, among the period-appropriate furnishings and informational placards, there is a butter churn. It is not Horon's butter churn. That one was lost centuries ago, probably burned for fuel during one of the desperate winters, its iron bands salvaged for some forgotten purpose. But it is the right type, the right era, the right style, and there's a crack running through its oak slats. The crack was added by the museum curators, a small historical detail, meant to suggest the wear and tear of daily 18th century life. They did not know about Horon's churn. They did not know that she had stood in her doorway on the evening of June 7, 1783, watching a crack spread through the wood and wondering when everything would finally split apart. But sometimes history gets things right by accident. The tourists file through, glancing at the exhibits, taking photographs, moving on to the waterfall or the lava field or the next stop on their ring road itinerary. They do not pause at the butter churn. They do not notice the crack. Outside, the volcano waits, and the moss keeps growing.